Deep beneath a fetid swamp, a band of adventurers pauses to rest. They have just cleared the first level in the reptile god's lair, but, fatigued by the preceding battles, they must stop before risking the floor below. There is the constant sound of dripping and sloshing throughout the watery lair. It is late in the evening when the cleric hears a scraping noise break the calm below. As it grows nearer, she silently alerts the rest of the party, and they prepare themselves for a coming battle. They wait with drawn swords and bated breath as the scraping turns to a slithering and approaches from the nearby stairs. Quick as a flash, a giant snake wielding a spear with humanoid arms appears up the stairs. One of the reptile god's foul children has found the exhausted party, and it will take both luck and skill for the heroes to survive. Hi, my name is Andrew, and today I'm talking about random encounters, what they are for, and how to use them. Why should you use random encounters? I think you should use random encounters because they reinforce the idea that the world is a dangerous place. You can't just rest in a dungeon or travel through the wilderness without the risk of encountering something crazy. The wilderness isn't safe, and neither are dungeons. They can act as a way to break up the pacing of adventuring by including a conflict that doesn't necessarily advance the plot. If you are constantly having plot-focused encounters, it can become exhausting. And while I would say that random encounters should usually be combat, they don't always need to be. Random encounters also play into the way that D&D is a resource management game. What do I mean by this? The characters have several limited use abilities and features, things like hit points, hit dice, rages, spell slots, action surge. A random encounter will force the characters to use up some of those resources. There are two major vectors to random encounters: when and what. When is an encounter going to occur? The typical way to determine this is to roll a d6, and if you get a 6, there's an encounter. However, there's a couple other ways that I've used. One way is to have every player roll a d20. If any of the players get a 1, then there's an encounter. If there's more than one, then it's a more difficult encounter. Statistically speaking, this is pretty similar to a 1 in 6 chance. 1 in 6 is about 16.7%, whereas if you have, say, a party of 4, each d20 has a 5% chance of getting a 1, and so that's a 20% chance. Another way of encounter is to roll a d12. If you get an 11 or 12, there's an encounter. 11 is a normal difficulty encounter, and 12 is a more difficult encounter. The other vector is what. What is the encounter? Now, there's a couple ways to determine this. The first is to come up with a chart or a list, or use one if you are running an adventure, let's say. And I've done this before, but it can be a lot of work for very little reward. Because if you tailor the encounters to the player's level, which I usually do, you'll have to modify the chart every time they level up, which means that there's a ton of redundant effort. Another thing that you can do is you can just flip through the monster manual, look for something that's about level appropriate, and just pick something that looks like it's going to be fun. You can also use online tools to generate an encounter. Here's one that I use. Here is the random encounter generator that I like to use. I will be sure to put a link in the description. And we see that we have a ton of different variables that we can play with. The numbers of PCs, the level of those PCs, and also the difficulty. I usually like to keep it to either hard or deadly for my random encounters, but we see that we have a ton of different options. It's been a while since I've used an et, so I think I'm going to run with that. And the question, of course, comes up is how often should you be rolling for encounters? My rule is that in a dungeon, you roll for an encounter every hour not spent adventuring, unless the party's taking a long rest, at which point there's only 2 rolls for the night. The reason for this is that if you rolled for each hour during a long rest, that'd be 8 rolls, and you'd almost be able to guarantee that there'd be 1, maybe even 2 encounters. And at that point, you're kind of removing the random part of random encounters. My rule while traveling is that you roll once per day spent in the wilderness, unless it's hazardous terrain, things like swamps, mountains, or wasteland, at which point I roll twice per day. And the way I usually rule it is that once there's an encounter during a journey, the rest of the journey passes uneventfully. That is, of course, unless the journey is part of the adventure itself. One thing to keep in mind is that not every journey needs to have encounters. At higher levels, it's perfectly reasonable to just skip through travel and say that time passes. You can also choose to remove one of those 2 vectors and decide to use a specific set encounter and just randomly determine when, or you can decide to randomly determine what the encounter is going to be but have it set at a specific time. The main reason to use random encounters in 5e is to prevent the party from being able to go Nova in every single combat. We're trying to discourage the party from resting too often, because if they do, then it's going to ruin encounter balance and it's going to eliminate a lot of drama. One thing that you will notice is that if you establish that random encounters are tougher than the normal combats, the players will choose to keep going just to avoid the risk of facing a random encounter. Another reason that random encounters need to be pretty nasty is that encounter building rules in 5e are kind of crazy. They assume 6 to 8 medium encounters per long rest. I've been playing for 6 years and I don't think I've ever seen more than 4 encounters in an average adventuring day. So, if you're using a random encounter and you want the players to feel any amount of real challenge, it's going to need to be pretty nasty, because it might be the only encounter that day, especially if they're traveling. Remember the example from earlier? I use a salamander, which is a CR5 monster, against a 3rd level party, and I literally just flipped through the monster manual until I found something that was about CR appropriate. Now, a salamander is like a fire elemental, so I just decided to reflavor it to be one of the children of the reptile god and have it be immune and do poison damage instead of immune and do fire damage. It took me less than a minute to prepare for that fight, but the build up to the fight, the actual fight, and the consequences of that fight took well over an hour. And so random encounters can also be a great way to eat up game time if the players have gotten a lot further than you were anticipating. Random encounters don't need to be combat encounters. For my first campaign, I was very inspired by Skyrim, so I decided to have my own unique encounter system, which had very funny and unrelated encounters. The classic example for me is Mike the Liar. Mike is a Khajiit, he's like a cat man, and over the course of a playthrough of Skyrim, you will encounter Mike the Liar several times, and he will often say strange and humorous things. So here's what I did. If you roll a 1, you encounter somebody looking for help. This is a little side quest that the players can go on or not, and I usually keep the length of those side quests to about a session. If they roll a 2, then there's a random NPC. This is not necessarily an encounter, it's just somebody that the players might choose to interact with. If you roll a 3 or a 4, you get some kind of strange scenery. A cabin that's been long abandoned in the middle of the woods, or a singular tree in the middle of a giant clearing. If you roll a 5 or a 6, you get combat. Using that system, I didn't roll for encounters as often. I would usually do about twice per week of travel, or once whenever they long rested in a dungeon. That system worked pretty well for the laissez-faire style of game that I was running at the time, in which some random encounters would totally derail the momentum of the game, and that was perfectly fine. Overall, I'd say that random encounters should reinforce the idea that the world is a dangerous place. They should be pretty tough, so as to prevent random encounters from feeling like busy work. With that said, thank you guys for watching. Peace out.